Hi, welcome to the first lecture on Chapter 9. In Chapter 9, we are working with rhythm. And you noticed when you took the vocabulary quiz, when you read the chapter, that there was a lot of vocabulary in this chapter, a lot of terms to understand. And I have scaled back somewhat on the number of terms, but even scaled back, there's still quite a few. And so I want to review those briefly. When you're looking at rhythm in a poem, you're often looking for the stresses on different syllables. So you want to know where emphasis is placed on syllables and where emphasis is not placed. So which syllables have an accent or a beat? Those are the stressed syllables. And which syllables are not stressed and are called slack syllables. For example, emphasis. Emphasis. The stress is on the first syllable. There's an accent there. The remaining two syllables are unstressed, so those are the slack syllables. Emphasis. When we focus on rhythm, we're looking for recurring patterns of stresses and pauses in a poem. If there's a fixed rhythm pattern in the poem, then we're talking about meter. And I'm going to be focusing on one type of meter in this chapter, and that's the iamb. It's the most common. It's a metrical foot in verse where you have an unaccented or slack syllable followed by a stressed or emphasized or accented syllable. So it's unstress, stress, unstress, stress, unstress, stress. Once you've determined that you're working with iambs, you want to divide your poetic line into feet. The foot is the basic unit of measurement in metrical poetry. And that just means after each iamb, drawing a line to separate the different iambic feet. And then if there's a pause within a line of poetry, and this is a light pause, we're talking about a caesura. And so that's how you would describe it if you were writing about the poem or discussing the poem and you notice that there's a light pause, you would refer to the caesura. And all of this work that we've just noted, when we engage in that work, we're engaging in scansion. This is the practice of describing your rhythmic patterns in a poem by looking at where the syllables are accented, looking at where they're slack, looking at where there's caesuras, and separating out the metrical feet in the poem. Don't stress out over this. People tend to get stressed sometimes, especially if they're new to scansion. I have put in this week's Moodle block a very good step-by-step guide to scanning a poem. It's 10 steps, and I'd like you to read through that article, and I think you'll better understand how scansion works. And then finally, we want to think about the end of the poetic line. If the line continues on grammatically to the next line of verse, it's described as a run-on line. It doesn't end in punctuation, it carries over to the next line grammatically. And the use of run-on lines in a poem is called enjambment. So you're looking at enjambed lines. They're jammed basically one against the other, and grammatically they keep going. If, however, you have punctuation at the end of a line, or even if grammatically you know you need to have a distinct pause, that's referred to as an end-stopped line. One of the best ways to recognize where you have stressed and slack syllables, to understand the rhythm of a poetic line, where do you have caesuras, what is the impact of a run-on line or an end-stop line, the best way is to read the poem out loud. And we learned this very early in the term, that it's always recommended that you read the poem out loud. And I would further recommend that you go back into Chapter 9 on page 165, the Get with the Beat section, and read out loud the 3 examples in that section. And I think you'll already start to hear the rhythm and the stresses and the slack syllables and the pauses. The poem I want to look at in this lecture is a great example of rhythm and the impact of run-on lines and the impact of distinct pauses within the line. This is We Real Cool by Gwendolyn Brooks. We real cool. The pool players, 7 at the Golden Shovel. We real cool. We left school. We lurk late. We strike straight. We sing sin. We thin gin. We jazz June. We die soon. So first, let's look at what's happening in the poem. We have 7 pool players in a pool hall, and we know that they're young. They should be in school. Instead, they're in the pool hall. They stay out late. There's music involved. They sing sin. They jazz June. There's drinking involved. And they will die soon. They will die young. How does Brooks use rhythm to increase our understanding of the experience of these young men? Notice first the many elements that we've already studied this term. Her use of repetition, and her use of alliteration, and her use of rhyme. She weaves these throughout the poem, and that contributes to the rhythm, and it parallels the musicality in the references to singing and to jazz. So we have music referenced in the poem, in the young men's experience, and we also have that musicality mirrored in the rhythm of the poem. Now we might ask, why does she end each line with we? We real cool, we left school, we lurk late, we strike straight. Well, part of that would be to emphasize the group nature of these young men hanging out together playing pool, the emphasis on the group identity. But they're also young men, and maybe they're not entirely sure of the strength of this identity, and so it's simultaneously emphasized and slightly undermined by the pauses in the poem. She embeds pauses with the use of the period midline, and even though this is a run-on line, there's a slight pause after the word we each time. And that pause is emphasized even more by the space between the stanzas. If we have a group of men who've left school, they're hanging out in a pool hall, and we find that we die soon, we might think about the use of the period in the middle of the line, which literally emphasizes finality and interrupts the poetic line, much as these lives will be interrupted and ended too soon. I've included a recording of Gwendolyn Brooks reading this poem, actually talking about it a little bit and reading it. And in our chapter, there's a short section where she discusses the poem We Real Cool. And so if you haven't read that already, I encourage you to do so.